All right, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, I guess now. I'm Mike Albertson. I'm the Deputy Director here at the Center for Global Security Research at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory. Thank you, as always, for taking the time to join us for one of our presentations. Today, it's my sincere pleasure to welcome uh, Dr. Brad Roberts, who's the director here at CGSR, for his CGSR lecture titled U.S. Nuclear Policy 101, How It's Made and Implemented and How It Has Evolved. His talk today is in response to some recent lectures that he gave here at the National Laboratory, as well as the release of the recent Strategic Posture Commission. He was asked to speak a little bit more about how nuclear policy is made and implemented in the US government, which is a topic he's well familiar with given his time as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for nuclear missile defense policy in the Obama administration. He's also going to talk a little bit about how this policy has evolved over the last 3 decades and some of the challenges which lie ahead. We wanted to make this available as part of our standard CGSR lecture series and get it recorded so that people who weren't able to join us at the 1 p.m. start time could watch it here at the lab in the near future. I'm going to go ahead and dispense with his bio, which is available on the CGSR website, as he's well familiar to many of you in the audience. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the ground rules, Dr. Roberts is going to deliver his remarks for about 30 to 45 minutes, at which point we're going to open the floor for discussion. Please raise your hand electronically. Please submit your questions to me in the chat room, and that way we can get as many of you into the conversation as possible when he gives his remarks. So with that, Brad, I'll turn the floor over to you, and I'll come back when it's time for the discussion period. Thanks.
Great, Mike. Thanks to you for the kind introduction and for taking on the task of chairing this meeting. And thanks to everybody else for your time and interest in the subject this afternoon. Hayden, why don't you go ahead and put the slides up, please? So as Mike has already indicated, this is really a talk in two parts. One is the how, and the other is the what. How is policy made and implemented, and what is the policy, and how has it evolved in recent years? Next slide, please. So the structure of the briefing is a few snapshots of the policymaking process to give you a sense of how policy is made and implemented. Then a look at continuity and change in U.S. nuclear policy since the end of the Cold War, and a look ahead at the so-called inflection point, to cite the president. And I'll close with just a slide or two on implications for the U.S. nuclear enterprise. Next slide, please. So who makes nuclear policy? Well, the president does. And the president may be extensively involved or only at the margins or at the conclusion of the process. Their political appointees make the policy. The cabinet makes the policy together with the president. And at the beginning of each term, or more precisely, their first term as president, presidents issue a presidential study directive. They issue quite a few of them. And these reflect ideas articulated in the party platform and on the campaign trail. But they're basically get started strategies. Go look at this problem. There may be congressional guidance that's been given to shape the review, and I'll talk to that in a moment. But the president's political appointees are their executive agents for this activity. As I've already suggested, presidents are involved to varying degrees. In the case of the Obama administration, I think it's the case that there were 20 or so meetings at the cabinet level, at the National Security Council level, that involved the president in the making of U.S. nuclear policy. Other administrations have had far fewer such meetings. And there are many stakeholders who try to influence policy in the political parties, in the think tank communities, in academia, among allies, and of course, much in the news in the last couple of weeks, the Strategic Posture Commission, of which there have been two. And these are congressionally appointed activities whose principal function is to advise the Congress on what directions and policy they should support. Next slide, please. How is policy made? Well, in the 1990s, an innovation was introduced: nuclear posture reviews. To be sure, every administration before that had gone through a review of nuclear policy, generally as part of its review of defense strategy. But after the Cold War, beginning in 1994, each administration has done a review called a nuclear posture review. The one that I co-directed in 2009 began with extensive congressional guidance. This was in reaction to the perception that U.S. nuclear policy and strategy had kind of disintegrated in the early 2000s, that there wasn't much focus, attention, or direction to policy. And the Congress said, we need a soup to nuts review. We need to know how non-proliferation, disarmament, arms control, strategic stability, deterrence, extended deterrence, assurance of allies, counter-proliferation, how does all of that fit together in some coherent way? Other times, the Congress chooses not to issue such guidance. It did so in 2017 because it chose not to do so. It chose not to give guidance in 2017 because it didn't want to open the nuclear can of worms in an election season when it was presumed that the Democrats were going to be returned to the White House. Nuclear posture reviews are sometimes very small group activities involving just a few leaders in making the major decisions. Other times there's a large cast. I like to joke that I presided over a 7-ring circus. There were 7 working groups in the nuclear posture review I ran. They worked diligently each week, and every Friday afternoon we came together to share our work and set out the next assignments. And that was essentially the opening analytic phase of a nuclear posture review described here. They all begin in the same place with the security environment. Most of them then explore policy options. And then the process kind of transitions over to the formal interagency NSC-led process. Then there's a phase when things percolate up to the presidential level. And then comes the writing phase, which never goes quickly, because that's when you discover all the things you thought you agreed about, you in fact don't agree about. Next slide, please. How is policy implemented? Well, once the nuclear posture review is completed, the report of the review is issued publicly, and it is to the Congress. Nuclear posture reviews report to the Congress. They reflect the judgments of the administration, but they report to the Congress. The administration then turns the results of the review into formal presidential and Secretary of Defense guidance. And some of the elements of these reviews fall outside of the normal guidance process. So, for example, in the Obama years, we were very much worried about the control over fissile materials and technologies and the expertise to make nuclear weapons. And this, of course, dealing with that challenge involved a lot of actors other than those in the Department of Defense. It also involved plenty in DoD. So implementation requires sustained interagency focus over a long period of time. Some NPRs and quadrennial defense reviews and missile defense reviews get a lot of traction, others don't. The ones that get traction mostly emphasize mainstreaming the results into standard departmental processes such as programming and planning. In the space I occupied when I was in the Pentagon, there was a very old safe, and the tracking sheet on the front of the roller indicated it hadn't been opened in 6 years. And there was one document in this safe, as it turned out, and it was the top secret implementation plan for the last nuclear posture review. That was a problem. The top secret nature of the implementation plan made it generally inaccessible and thus a poor guide to all of the activities that needed to be mainstreamed in programming and planning processes. Next slide, please. So that's a snapshot, a 7-minute snapshot of the policy process, who makes policy, how it's made, and how it's implemented. Let me talk now for a few minutes about the evolution of U.S. nuclear policy since the Cold War. So how have these nuclear posture reviews evolved? Next slide, please. The end of the Cold War, roughly 1989. The single integrated operational plan still existed. And there was a strategy in place that used the word prevail in talking about U.S. objectives in nuclear war. And the posture was, of course, huge, 21,000 warheads. And it was sized and functioned, if you will, according to the requirements of deterring the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And there was a very robust development and production capacity. Next slide, please. Then came the nuclear posture reviews. The Clinton administration, Secretary of Defense Les Aspin was a rather a former academic who'd served for a long time in the House of Representatives as chair of the Armed Services Committee. He came down to the Pentagon and led a bottom-up review of defense strategy, asking what should be American defense strategy now that the Cold War is over and the Soviet Union's gone. And in rapid succession, he did a follow-on review, nuclear posture review, that was led by Ash Carter. And the core idea in that review was lead, but hedge. Lead in the reduction of nuclear threats. They argued that Russia was not an object of our deterrence strategy. They were very focused on, quote, rogue states, but hedge against the possibility that things in Russia might not turn out for the best. The Bush administration's nuclear posture review was, well, the common adjective is bold. It set out a radical new approach to deterrence and posture, emphasizing a new triad of capabilities: offense, defense, and infrastructure. And it was, the classified report was provided to the Hill, leaked literally within 10 minutes. And thus it became impractical for the administration to defend publicly a document that couldn't be discussed publicly. Next slide, please. The first instantiation of the Posture Commission came in 2008. And this was aimed at restoring some policy coherence and finally initiating a modernization plan. Northern California's congressional representative at the time, Ellen Tauscher, played the critical role in making this happen. And the group agreed on everything but the CTBT, and it had a significant impact on the Obama NPR. The Obama NPR began with the president's speech in Prague in April of 2009, recommitting the United States to the long-term goal of reducing nuclear weapons. But he also committed in that speech to ensure that deterrence would remain safe, secure, and effective, and be provided to our allies so long as nuclear weapons remain. That speech is a little bit like a Rorschach test. People remember one side or the other, but not both elements to it. Next slide, please. The Trump administration's review was essentially a review led by Secretary of Defense Mattis, and it was much more mainstream than people expected. The one significant source of controversy was the proposal for 2 supplements to the U.S. nuclear arsenal. And the Biden nuclear posture review. Again, more mainstream than some people expected. There was a long debate about changing declaratory policy. Ultimately, that decision was rejected, and the report again emerged as mainstream. Next slide, please. So there's a lot of continuity over these 25 years of nuclear policymaking, 20 years. The commitment to a comprehensive, balanced approach. The Biden administration's, the top line of the nuclear posture review says a balanced strategy. And that refers to the formulation in the Obama years was, no, the formulation of the first Strategic Posture Commission was that there should be a balanced approach. The political and economic means would be used to reduce and ultimately eliminate nuclear threats. But so long as threats remain, military tools would be used to deter and otherwise protect our security. And every administration has re-articulated this in some way. In deterrence strategy, there's a great deal of continuity. It begins with the fact that most presidents arrive thinking, the last guy left me too many weapons, old ideas, and no way forward with the Russians. I'm going to solve all those problems. And they roll up their sleeves and go to work and discover that some of those problems are just insoluble, or at least very difficult in the near term. Many presidents have arrived tempted by the idea of minimum deterrence, but have ended up rejecting it, largely on the argument that it would undermine extended deterrence. A lot of continuity in declaratory policy. Nobody's changed the fundamental basis of that policy, which is ambiguity. We say we reserve the right to employ nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances, but we're not telling you precisely when we would use them. A lot of continuity in force posture. Everybody's decided to maintain the triad and the forward-based nuclear weapons in Europe. And in risk reduction strategy, a lot of continuity. The test moratorium remains in place despite a lot of political change in America and a lot of disagreement over the test ban treaty. And both parties are committed to arms control as a means to support U.S. national interests, and both are lamenting the current state of the arms control agenda. So a lot of continuity in nuclear policy over these decades. Next slide, please. But also some important elements of change. The first elements of change are in judgments about the security environment. Doesn't look the way it looked in the 1990s. And elements of change in policy priorities. Extended deterrence is a phrase, is a term that was not used in the 1994 nuclear posture review. And the last 3 reviews have all spoken extensively about extended deterrence. China wasn't mentioned in the first NPR. China is very important now, etc. Next slide, please. So these are elements of the Biden agenda drawn from its nuclear posture review report. Maintain a high bar. Utilize integrated deterrence. I'll come back to that. Replace the triad. Strengthen extended deterrence. To deliver a modern, adaptive nuclear security enterprise based on an integrated strategy for risk management, resilience, innovation, and workforce initiatives. A fairly ambitious agenda. Next slide, please. But this agenda butts up against the reality of a lot of division in the American political community about where to go with nuclear policy, and friction over how changes in the security environment make new things necessary or at least possible. And these are some of the enduring topics in debate. The Biden administration said it's committed to reducing the role of nuclear weapons, just as all of the preceding administrations had said, but doing so appears implausible, impractical at this time. I've hinted a little bit at minimum deterrence. Question 4 has been much in discussion. To what extent does the strategic restraint we exercise in testing and in the development of new weapons and in the deployment of more weapons, we exercise a lot of strategic restraint. Has this influenced others in any constructive way, other perhaps than incentivizing them to compete in new ways? You've had a chance to look at this list of key issues. I just wanted to bring out that while there's a lot of continuity, there's also a lot of division. Next slide, please. A couple of data points for the discussion about nuclear policy. People sometimes say that we're maintaining a Cold War nuclear force. Well, in the graph on the left, the Cold War nuclear force is the red, and the current nuclear force is the blue. So yes, it still has the triad, but the actual size of the force is much smaller than at the end of the Cold War. The chart on the right's a little cryptic, but what it's bringing home is the loss of diversity in the force since the end of the Cold War. I recently read an unclassified summary of nuclear delivery systems in Europe, and that summary from a non-governmental think tank said that Russia has 31 systems with which to deliver nuclear weapons against targets in Western Europe, and we have the B-61 bomb, of course. I'm not suggesting we need to match the Russians in numbers and types of diversity of delivery systems, but we've gone quite far in stripping ourselves of the diversity we once thought was necessary. Next slide, please. This is another way to think about the reductions process. This is total megatonnage of the arsenal and total number of warheads in the arsenal. And what you can see is the total megatonnage greatly grew in the 1950s, peaked in 1960, while the total number of warheads continued to grow until 1967. And then in part through precision and lower yield, but in part through reductions in the force, we're now back in a situation, well, this is a 2017 number, more reductions have been accomplished. A rather dramatic transformation of the arsenal in the period since the end of the Cold War. Next slide, please. Minimum deterrence. Minimum deterrence is the idea that all you need is to threaten massive retaliation, and that threat will be credible because you will have been provoked by someone attacking you first. And Bill Perry and Tom Kalina, Bill Perry, well known to this community, Tom Kalina perhaps less so, but from the Plowshares Fund, wrote a book together called The Button about 4 years ago, in which they argued the case for eliminating the ICBM force and moving to essentially a peacetime monad dependent purely on submarines, because there is no risk of a disarming first strike, and therefore there's no need for most of the attributes of the U.S. nuclear deterrent as it now exists. I mean, Secretary Perry is, of course, influential on these matters, and this is a substantial point of debate. Next slide, please. So that was a quick tour of the landscape as it's evolved since the end of the Cold War. Where do we stand today, and where are we headed? Next slide, please. So both in addition to in addition to nuclear posture reviews, every administration has to issue a national security strategy. This is another obligation levied by the Congress. And the Biden national security strategy makes this argument about the inflection point. It echoes an argument made by the Trump administration about living in a moment of change in the international order. The Biden argument goes on to talk about a, quote, decisive decade in which the choices we make will determine, well, they're repeating that thought on, will determine the direction of our world and impact the security and prosperity of the American people for decades to come. And the National Defense Strategy picks up this theme and talks about rejecting business as usual. These are high-level political statements. They're supposed to percolate down through the executive branch. They don't always do so. Next slide, please. So both the National Security Strategy and the Nuclear Posture Review talk about emerging challenges to deterrence. They talk about the erosion of deterrence. The emerging challenges are significant. Any one of these problems would be a major challenge for the United States. The fact that we face all of them simultaneously is a bigger challenge. Next slide, please. And an argument that we've developed here at CGSR is this one, that let's think back to the beginning of the post-Cold War period, 1989, 90, 91. Dramatic changes in the international political environment. These dramatic changes made possible changes in U.S. nuclear policy and posture. And those were changes that everyone wanted to make. Reduce the role, reduce the number, build arms control, promote strategic stability, strengthen the non-proliferation regime, etc. We live in a security environment today in which the changes are as dramatic and are likely to prove to be as transformational for U.S. nuclear policy and posture as were the ones 30 years ago. Unfortunately, the things we're going to have to do to adjust are things we don't want to do. We don't want to end the reductions process. We don't want to rejoin an arms race. We don't want to build new nuclear weapons. We, speaking broadly as the nation. These things are all outside our comfort zone politically. And we don't want to walk away from arms control agreements. We don't want to see the nuclear non-proliferation regime weakened. But this is the environment we're moving into. And Russia, China, and North Korea are drivers of this new environment, but that's because they began to adapt to changes they didn't like. They began to adapt already in the 1990s. And we've coasted for a long time on our supremacy and presumed strategic dominance and superior innovative capacities. And now we're playing catch up, trying to make our own adaptations at the speed of relevance, to cite Secretary Mattis. And the recent report of the Congressional Commission on the U.S. Strategic Posture is aimed at accelerating this transition, this transformation, this period of adaptation. And it's conspicuous. It's important because of its bipartisan character and the fact that people from the very far left and the very far right were able to agree on a strategy for strengthening deterrence that included some important departures from this tradition of continuity and change that I've talked about. Next slide, please. So a closing slide on what does all of this imply for the enterprise? Well, we're of course the lead in delivering some of the replacement capabilities that are being produced on a just-in-time delivery schedule. Of course, we don't have responsibility for the delivery systems, but preventing a significant erosion of nuclear balance during the period of the transition from current to replacement capabilities is emerging as a big problem. Secondly, as we move into this new environment, our ability to compete with Russia and China will be more valuable to us than before. It will have higher deterrence value and higher assurance value. And of course, our competitive capacity is low relative to theirs at this time. And the enterprise, as we've all heard from our director here and from the other directors and from Jill Ruby, is that business as usual isn't going to get us where we need to go. And there needs to be some changes in culture and orientation to ensure that we are adapting at the speed of relevance. And you've read the rest of the slide, so let me not belabor it. I think that's my last slide. Let's go one more. There you go. So please visit our website. You'll find lots of work on these topics. Mike, let me return it to you for the Q&A portion. Thanks everybody for your attention.